Here today for a return visit is Lewis A. Bedford IV. And here is a picture of Lewis and his grandfather, Lewis A. Bedford Jr. I asked him to send me this picture because when Bill Holston was here, he talked about what a hero Lewis's grandfather had been to him and in his life legacy that he wanted to leave behind. And Bill, in fact, was the person who told me all about Lewis. And so I invited him to speak to you all about voting rights last spring, and you liked him so much, we brought him back. Lewis, it's all yours, my dear.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. You know, the last time that I was here, I spoke about voting and how there were a lot of issues whenever it came to us actively trying to participate in this democracy. I spoke about gerrymandering. I spoke about a lot of the election laws that actually go to the core of what it means to truly be a part and participate in the system. So whenever it comes to this presentation today, I'm going to take a little bit of a broader look. I'm going to talk about our civil rights on the whole. So whenever it comes to our civil rights, I'm first going to talk about what that civil right actually is. Then I'm going to talk about what happens whenever our rights are infringed upon. And then I'm going to walk us through whether or not this is happening now. And I'm also going to end up asking you the question, what would you do if your rights were on the line? So first and foremost, I want to say this: you are who you choose to be. And whenever it comes to those choices, oftentimes we talk about whether or not you're going to be an upstander or a bystander. Now, a bystander is someone who sits around and sees some of these horrible things happening to people and unfortunately does not speak up or say anything. That's what a bystander is. Now, an upstander, on the other hand, is someone who will speak up, someone who will actively fight for the people who are around them, someone who will actively make sure that the people who need help, the people who need to have a voice, will be someone that they're actually able to fight for. But with that, though, I want to leave everyone with this. What would you do if those were your rights? What would you do if your rights were ultimately on the line? So first, whenever I go with that, let's talk about a civil right. A civil right is a right that is legally protected, a right that is protected through law. So whenever it comes to that, you can look at privacy, you can look at health care, you can even look at the right to freedom of speech, but also you can look at education as well. And so as I go through this presentation, make sure you keep that in mind, because what I'm going to talk about, I'm also going to talk about from a broader perspective of not just the state of Texas, but this country, but also how each state learns from each other, from the good and from the bad that that state does. So once again, just keep this in mind as I move forward through this presentation. But whenever our rights are on the line, everyone suffers. It's not just we operate as an individual, we are all a part of a whole. I want to make sure I mention that again. We are all a part of the whole. So whenever this happens, please remember once again that this is not something that is just an obscure idea that happened in the past. This is not something that happened generations and generations ago. This is also something that is still happening today. So whenever I ask you the question, is this still happening today? The answer is obviously yes. It's obviously yes. So let's talk about education. Did you know that in between July 2021 and June 2022, the state of Texas outlawed over 800 books? 800 books. And that was just over the course of 1 year. And we are not talking about books on the fringes of society, as some people may claim that they are. We're talking about books by Toni Morrison, Ta-Nehisi Coates. We're talking about books by Maya Angelou. Those are the books that we are talking about. We're talking about books that are written even about people that are made the city of Dallas as incredible as what it is. Talking about books about my grandfather, books about Juanita Craft. Those are the books that are being taken off of the shelves of school districts across this state. Those are the books. So whenever we think about what are we needing to do, we need to realize that all of our rights are on the line. That this is not just a passive thing. This is something that is actively happening around us. We all need to make sure that we are aware of the world, because if we don't, and if we aren't, the world will unfortunately pass us by. And whenever it comes to our rights, we also need to realize this. Our rights are not taken away with one broad stroke of a pen. It happens slowly at first, and then it's all at once. So let's just take, for example, the state of Florida whenever it comes to education. Now, I'm sure many of you may have heard, but the state of Florida has actively tried to take away AP African American history, saying that in certain aspects of that, there isn't an educational value whenever it comes to Black queer studies or Black feminism. So we are talking about James Baldwin. Those are the people that the state of Florida is saying doesn't have any kind of an educational value. But I also want to take the time to mention this. Even when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement, there may be people who may not agree with that movement, but what you cannot disagree with is that movement has had a very broad impact. And that movement was born out of pain. The pain that many people see, the pain that many people have to confront on a day-to-day basis. And the unfortunate reality is this. There are conversations that I know that I've had with my father and even with my grandfather whenever it comes to interactions with the police. That is the unfortunate reality that I know I've faced. And what I've been told is that regardless of what happens, your one job and your one responsibility is to come home. Is to come home. Because if anything were to happen to you, there's only one person who will be able to tell that story. And that's not going to be you. So whenever it comes to education, I also want to make sure that I mention this as well. In the state of Montana, they're actively working to try to ban anything that is considered a scientific theory and not fact. So let's talk about what that actually is. We're talking about gravity. We're talking about relativity. Because these are things that we are able to observe, but ultimately those are theories, because there is still a lot about science that we do not fully understand. But those are the things that people are actively trying to come after. And though people may draw this broad stroke and say, well, we're only trying to talk about evolution, but that is not the case. We're talking about very core scientific principles, where if you no longer talk about gravity, we're impacting physics. We're impacting a lot of different ways in a lot of different areas of education. And if you strike at the core of our education system, we're leaving society much worse off than it was before. And also now here in Texas, we're going after diversity initiatives. Now, a lot of these diversity initiatives were created in order to make sure that there were Black and brown people and even women who are able to be in these spaces. But unfortunately, we have found ourselves in a situation where those same diversity initiatives that were productive, that were positive, that had a genuine impact, we're now trying to say we don't need those anymore. We don't need those in the education system. Because of these impacts, because of these laws, we are unfortunately finding ourselves where we are becoming worse off as a society. But in order for us to be able to move forward, we have to move forward in understanding of the world the way that it is. That is the only way that we are going to be able to figure out the best path to move forward. The only way that we are going to be able to build solidarity to make sure that we are able to truly understand, once again, the way the world is. So now I'm going to talk about healthcare and privacy. Whenever it comes to healthcare and privacy, I want to make sure that everyone knows this. That even though you may believe that the messages that you are sending on Facebook or on Instagram belong to you and are not going to be shared, that is unfortunately not a reality. It's just not. So whenever we look at the state of Nebraska, there was a woman who actively tried to seek an abortion. And unfortunately, her messages on social media ended up being used against her. So once again, I need to ask, what would you do if your rights were on the line? And whenever it comes to these apps that people use, over 50 million people use menstrual tracking apps. That's roughly 1/6 of the total population of this state. Of this country. So once again, I must ask, what would you do if your rights were on the line? And even whenever it came to COVID-19 in Texas, there was a lot of talk about how the state of Texas, we should not mandate any vaccinations. It is abhorrent, the fact that the state would do anything of that nature. When the reality is the state of Texas has had certain vaccine mandates. We have. In fact, I listed some of them up on the screen. Measles, mumps, rubella, polio. But unfortunately, when people find it in a situation where it is more advantageous for them to be able to politicize certain things that may be beneficial to the whole to benefit the few, that is where, unfortunately, we see a very large infringement on our rights, and we see our rights being slowly taken away. So now let's once again talk about voting. And I just want to put this in perspective. Whenever I last came here to speak about voting, I spoke about gerrymandering. I spoke about a lot of these issues. But a lot of the same issues that people faced during the 1960s, unfortunately, where they showed up to the polls, believed that they were able to vote, and unfortunately an election judge gave them the wrong information and told them that they were not eligible, when in fact they were. That is still happening today. It is. And we still see long lines. We still see questions about voter education and even voter registration. The issues that we saw such a long time ago are still, once again, happening today. So once again, I have to ask, what would you do if your rights were on the line? Also, whenever it comes to redistricting, and I know I spoke about this, but I want to make sure I speak about it again because it is truly important. In between 2010 and 2020, over 95% of the growth of this state came from people of color. 95%. And during the redistricting process, there were state senators that said that they did not consider race as a part of that conversation at all. Didn't consider it as a part of that conversation at all. And now I also want to make sure I talk about partisan poll watchers. So for those of you who may not know, Dallas County is a county-wide polling county, meaning that you can vote anywhere in the county on election day and during the early voting period. But because you can also go vote anywhere in the county, means that a particular candidate can also be on any polling location anywhere in the county. And because of that, we have seen people who have shown up as partisan poll watchers have gone to communities that don't look like them because that's where they believe fraud is taking place. In predominantly Black and predominantly Hispanic communities, people are showing up because that is where they believe fraud is taking place. And if people truly understood how difficult it was to vote in the state of Texas, if they truly understood, they wouldn't be believing that there was fraud. And in fact, I've had the opportunity to work in the Dallas County Central Count Station, meaning that all the votes, all the ballots go to that central location in Dallas. If people only knew how difficult it was to get the county on board to do one thing, it'd be very difficult to believe that the county was able to create a conspiracy in order to make sure that a certain person was elected and a certain person was not. So once again, what would you do if your rights were on the line? I'm not trying to push you to do anything, but I want to make sure that you all think. You leave this conversation today thinking, what would I do if my rights were on the line? Because the reality is, they are. They are on the line. They're on the line for each and every one of us. And even though it might not seem like it, it is. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with is this. What are you going to do today to make sure that yesterday's past does not become tomorrow's future? Think about it. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate being able to be here. And before I step down, I just want to say this one thing. I am incredibly appreciative to Sandy for giving me the opportunity to come back. You know, the last time that I had the opportunity to speak, Sandy wasn't here. So it was very nice to be able to put a face to the name. So with that, Sandy, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And thank you, each and every one of you.
Thank you.